I chose as a subject for the sermonette today the word completion. That's the title of the sermonette. But the sermonette has a subject which revolves around Bible numerology. That is an indication that certain numbers, where they are used in the Bible in certain ways, communicate a special meaning just by the numbers that are there. Many people have believed highly in the validity of numerology in the Bible. In fact, I would say many people have taken it way too far. And for some people it became an idol, and for some people it seemingly became their religion. So we want to be careful that when we talk about numerology, we're not carrying it to that extreme. We don't want to be overly exuberant about it. But we don't want to ignore either the fact that it could be communicating some message to us. Today there's a number which communicates to us completion of a subject. When we see it in the Bible, likely thing to consider is whether or not God is communicating to us that the subject that's being discussed at that point is about completion. Some other examples, I'll just hit a couple of other examples about numerology before we get into the meat of this sermonette. 40 years in the wilderness, Israel. Now the number 40, whenever we find it in the Bible, may be communicating, maybe, you have to consider it and make a judgment about whether or not it is, but it may be communicating to you a time of trying and testing. You see, the Israelites spent 40 years after they crossed the Red Sea, 40 years in the wilderness because of their disobedience of God when it came to going into the Promised Land. And so that became known as a time of trying and testing. 40 years in the wilderness. David, for example, also reigned for 40 years. Moses led Israel. I believe he was 80 years old when he began to lead Israel, but he led Israel for 40 years. So those are examples of a number, the number 40 conveying to us trying and testing, a period of time trying and testing. The number 7, and perfection. I put down here completion in the notes. Apparently I made a mistake there. The number 7 conveys completion or perfection, a perfect situation. There are how many days in a week? There are 7 days in the week. From Genesis we find that that was then the completion or the perfection of the weekly cycle. The annual holy days, they are perfect in the way that God designed them. There are 7 annual holy days. We see in the Bible, and we could go many examples of things that have to do with the number 7, and the number 7 conveying information to us in a lot of different places in the Bible. There are 7 trumpets, for example, 7 seals. Those are all examples of the number 7. This is not about the number 7, but just about the fact here in the introduction of this sermonette that numbers can convey meaning. They don't always convey meaning, but they well may convey some meaning to us. And I wanted to just pass that on to you. Let's be sure that we don't, that you don't take my message here to mean that you should go off of the deep end on numerology, as some I know have done. But today, completion is indicated by the number 3. The Bible indicates completion by the number 3, perfection by the number 7. So let's look at, because the title of the sermonette is completion, let's look at the number 3 using, guess how many examples? 3 examples. They're New Testament examples. 3 New Testament examples as they are used in the New Testament to communicate completion. And essentially the sermonette is going to be just to look at those 3 examples and to glean from those 3 examples the fact that the number 3 is communicating for us completion. Now we will get into the sermon, and the reason, of course, the sermonette is about completion and the number 3 is because that idea will be carried over into the sermon. So the sermonette and the sermon are different things, but they are tied together. Many times I find that's the case, even though I didn't give both of them. So who is tying them together and providing that? You know the answer. Christ was asked for a sign. And he did not respond too kindly to that request. In fact, probably at least 10 years ago, I gave a sermon on this request, and Christ answered. He was asked for a sign. Prove it. Prove to me you are the Messiah. I want a sign from you. Matthew chapter 12, verses 39 and 40. I believe it was the Pharisees who demanded a sign from him. He answered and said unto them, something that was a little bit probably offensive to them. And evil, because they thought they were righteous. They were convinced they were the most righteous of all people. They got right down to the final little tiny points of everything. So he said to them, an evil and adulterous generation, that wasn't very complimentary either, seeks after a sign. And there shall be no sign given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonah. Here's where the number 3 comes into play. As Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the grave 3 days and 3 nights. That was completion. He was dead for 3 days and 3 nights. The time period was a complete period to indicate that he was dead. So that's example number 1 of the Bible using the number 3, and very specific use of the number 3 there, isn't it? Using the number 3 to indicate that was a complete sign, the only sign they would get, and it indicated that Christ would be dead for 3 days. Second example is what's known as the Transfiguration. And here, the number 3 was taken because Christ took 3 of his disciples with him as witnesses. and out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall a matter be established. And so here, these 3 witnesses he took with him so that they could testify of what they had seen. Why didn't he take all of the apostles? I don't know. But he chose 3 as witnesses. Maybe the answer to that is because that indicated a finality to the matter. The number 3 here is in play in that regard. Matthew chapter 17, verse 1. Now there had been some other things that led up to this. We won't enter into those things. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, sons of thunder, James and John. So Peter, James, and John, Christ took with him up into a high mountain apart. Now, by apart, it means he left the others behind. So they were up in this high mountain apart from the other 9 apostles. And he was transfigured before them. His face did shine as the sun, his raiment was white as the light. So this vision or manifestation of Christ in a completely different form. And if you read on into it, you find also that Elijah and I believe Moses were there with him, or is it Abraham? I forgot now. Were there with him. He's transfigured before them, and he had taken 3 people with him to establish the truth of what they had seen. So that's the second example of the number 3. It was a complete number of people. The third example that I selected, which is relevant from the New Testament, Christ on the night of preceding his crucifixion. You might well imagine he knew what was going to happen to him, and it was a time of great difficulty for him, and so he would have been in a certain mental attitude. If you knew you were going to be tortured and killed the next day, you probably that might have been weighing quite heavily on you. And it was weighing quite heavily on Christ that night. In fact, Luke says that he prayed and great drops of blood as sweat came down on his forehead. So yeah, he was under a lot of stress, so much so that he actually bled through his skin. And here he went in the Garden of Gethsemane after they had partaken of the Passover meal. They went across the Cedron Brook over to the Mount of Olives where the Garden of Gethsemane was, and they often went there. And in that garden, he asked the disciples to wait while he went and prayed. I think he took a couple of them with him and said, "Wait here while I go there and pray." And he went there and prayed. He came back and he found they were asleep. He woke them up and said, "Couldn't you even stay awake while I went?" He said, "Wait here." And he went and prayed the second time. Came back and found them asleep the second time. So then he went the third time. 3 times he went and he prayed. And so the Bible uses these 3 examples to indicate this was completing his prayer there that night. He actually asked if this could pass from him. If he could not have to do this, it would be his wish, but nevertheless he would do as the Father wanted him to do. So that was it. That's the third example. So you have those three examples. The only sign that he was a Messiah, and that was 3 days and 3 nights. Then the transfiguration, when he took 3 witnesses to establish a complete witness of the thing that he had done, and then before his crucifixion he went and prayed 3 times to God the Father. So those 3 things illustrate the number 3 is used to communicate to us a complete set of something that occurs. And so that's the essence of this sermonette.